Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I'm continuing my beginner series on the FlyByWire A320 by looking at how to taxi, take off, and climb. This is part 5 of a series that I'm building on the absolute basics of flying airliners in flight sim, and each video builds on the previous one, so if you haven't checked those out yet, I really suggest that you do. In this video, I'll be looking at all the procedures you need to know to get the airplane working properly, when to adjust your throttle and flaps on takeoff, when to engage the autopilot, and a whole lot more, so make sure to stick around. I am by no means an airline captain, so I'm sure I'm doing a bunch of stuff wrong, but this is what works well for me in flight sim. Alright, I'm picking up exactly where I left off the previous video. The MCDU has been programmed with my entire flight plan, and it has all of the information it needs. The APU is running, and I'm pretty much ready for pushback. The first thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to the EFB, and I'm going to call for the tug. Once it's connected, what I'm going to do is turn the parking brake to off, and I'm going to request a straight pushback from the gate to start. It's not super easy to see where you're going when you're getting tugged back from the gate, so what I actually like to do is to just go to the external view and just have a look around to see where I'm going. There are some additional tools you can install to get a better pushback experience. Personally, I don't like using them just because it makes it more likely that you're going to have crashes to desktop with the more and more add-ons that you install. Once I get close to the taxiway that I want to align myself with, at that point, I'm going to head back to the internal view, and I'm going to go back to the EFB, and I'm going to request that the tug starts turning the airplane. I keep an eye on where it's turning the airplane so that I can adjust if I need to. I won't be perfectly placed on the runway, but it should be good enough. And then once I'm in a decent spot, I'm going to ask the tug to stop the pushback. And once we've come to a complete stop and he's disconnected, I will ask him to leave by pressing the little button down here. And at this point, I am ready to get the engines running. It takes a while to push back from the gate, and you can use that time to start the engines as well. I didn't do it here just because I wanted to make things a little bit simpler for the video. Before you start the engines, make sure that your parking brake is set down here, because otherwise when you do start the engines, you're going to start moving forward involuntarily. To start the engine, the first thing we've got to do is go to the overhead panel and make sure all of the fuel pumps are running, and also make sure that the APU bleed is on. Then the next thing you do is head down to the bottom pedestal, and what you're going to do is set the little knob here to the ignition start position. Once that's done, you can flip engine 2 to on, and the engine is going to start starting up. At this point, you can wait for the engine to start and just keep an eye on the numbers on the upper ECAM here. But if you have some good speakers or you've got a really nice pair of headsets on, you can head to the external view and get in on a tight shot of the engines as they're starting up. The fly-by-wire does have some really nice default sounds. The engine is finished starting up once all of the numbers have stabilized, and you'll see a little message appear here that says avail. It'll only be there for a couple of seconds. Once it is stabilized, you can then turn on the engine 1 switch and wait for the engine 1 to start up as well. Again, I'm going to wait until all the numbers have stabilized on the upper ECAM, and the lower ECAM is actually going to change screens once both engines are running properly. And there we go, the numbers are stabilizing and it's automatically switched to the flight control screen, so I know that everything is up and running on the engine. So I can go back to the mode and set it back to normal. At this point, there's only a few things left and we're going to be ready to taxi. The first of those things is actually on the glare shield. What I'm going to do is make sure that the flight director is on, as well as turn on all constraints on my route. Like that, I'll be able to see any altitude constraints along the way. You can see there is one right here at 4,000 feet for my first waypoint. I'll also set the initial cruise altitude by twisting this knob right here, and what I'm going to do is set it to 4,000 feet, which is the same altitude as that first constraint that I was just looking at. Next, I'll turn on the auto brake to max, and what that's going to do is that if I do abort the takeoff, it's automatically going to apply the brakes at maximum power. I'll also set my flaps to the first position, which you can see them extending right here, which is what I told the MCDU that I would be doing for my takeoff in the previous video. And finally, the last thing we need to do is set the initial trim. You don't absolutely need to do this step, but I do it just because it's a little bit more realistic. So we need to match up the center of gravity of the airplane, which you can get by going into the fuel menu and just stretching out this window right here so you can see the airplane on the right. You can see our center of gravity is 25.14. So you can see 25 is here and 30 is there. So it's probably right around there, I think. This number doesn't have to be super precise because the auto trim is going to take over once you're airborne, but it does help you to get off the ground a little bit easier if your trim is set properly. All right, with all of that done, I am ready to taxi to the runway, which luckily is right here. But before I get to that, I do want to remind you to make sure to hit the like button if you haven't already and to subscribe to get more similar content. Every 2 weeks, I'm publishing a new video with tips, tricks, and tutorials for Microsoft Flight Simulator, and your likes and subscribes are what keep this channel growing. All right, with that out of the way, we are ready to taxi. You can use idle power to taxi, but to get going, what I do is just apply a little bit of throttle to get moving, and then I bring it back to idle and just taxi along at idle power. You can go up to 30 knots in a straight line and 10 knots in a turn, but the first few times you actually have a stab at this, I really suggest that you take it a lot slower than that. You really need to get used to turning such a big airplane. It's very different from the general aviation airplanes. There are two different ways to take off in the A320. The first is called TOGA power, which stands for takeoff go around, and you do that by just applying full throttle on takeoff. There's another type of takeoff you can do called the flex takeoff. I won't be covering that here just because it's a little bit more complicated, and when you're just getting started, TOGA power is totally fine. Once I'm ready to go, I'm going to apply the brakes and I'm going to hold them down. I'll spool the engine up to about 50% throttle, and then I'm going to release the brakes and apply full throttle. I'm also applying about half forward pressure on the stick until around 80 knots. That's going to put a little bit more load on the nose wheel and make it a little bit easier to steer as I'm accelerating down the runway. Very quickly after that, you're going to notice little notches near the top of the airspeed indicator. The one we're interested in is the purple one. That's our rotation speed where we pull back on the stick. Once you've got a positive rate of climb, you can bring the landing gear up and you can increase your pitch to about 15 degrees. I usually go down to 10 degrees rather quickly after takeoff just because when there's departure constraints, I'm going to come up on them really fast if I stay at 15 degrees nose up. Soon after that, keep an eye on the airspeed indicator because you're going to go past the S speed, which is when you're going to bring the flaps up. The other thing to keep an eye on is when to put the throttle at the climb detent position, which is actually 2 positions below the TOGA position. Usually this happens at 2,500 feet and there's going to be an audible beep and the attitude indicator in the top left is going to say lever climb, which is your cue to put the throttle into the climb position. At this point, all I've got to do is maneuver around my departure procedure and enable the autopilot whenever I'm ready. I like to keep it off while I'm still maneuvering around the departure procedure like I am right now, but once I'm in a straight and level climb, I'm going to turn it on and let the plane handle it for me. To do that, I need to go onto the glare shield panel and press the AP1 button, and the plane is going to handle pretty much everything for me from this point on. At some point, the plane might yell at you with a loud beep that just doesn't stop, and that's probably because it wants you to turn the autopilot on. You can stop the sound though by just pressing the master caution button. And don't forget to keep an eye on your departure constraints. I'm still short of the first waypoint with that 4,000 foot ceiling, so I'll level off before I get there. I don't need to touch the throttles at all, and because we're below 10,000 feet, the airplane is automatically going to keep me below 215 knots, and you can even see there's a little notch in the airspeed indicator to tell you where it's going to stop accelerating. I'm coming up on that first waypoint with the 4,000 foot limit now, so I'm going to go to the autopilot panel. I'm going to turn the dial to 7,000 feet, which is the next limit on the next waypoint that's shown on the nav display. And once I'm past the waypoint, I'm just going to press up on that same dial to tell it to engage. The airplane's automatically going to go into a climb at this point, and it's going to adjust the throttle power automatically for me. I don't have to worry about it, unlike with a GA plane where I would still need to play with the throttle. Most likely, if you're flying with online ATC, they would have given you a higher initial altitude, but I just wanted to show you how to actually follow the constraints with the autopilot. You could also, of course, just climb up to your cruise altitude when you're flying offline because no one's really there to tell you not to. The last thing I want to mention before wrapping up is with regards to the altimeter setting. Right now you can see it's set to 29.87, which is the local setting that I was set for in Ontario. But once I go past a certain altitude, I'm gonna change it to the standard pressure of 29.92. To do that, I just press down on the altimeter knob and it'll say standard in the little display right above it. The exact altitude at which you switch to standard pressure is different depending on where you're flying in the world. In North America, it's 18,000 feet, and I believe in Europe it's much lower than that. Now that I've gone past my last constraint, I'm gonna set my final cruise altitude of 11,000 feet and engage that again just by pressing up on the altitude dial, and that's going to take me all the way to my destination in San Diego. The only thing I need to do at this point is monitor my altitude, airspeed, and course just to make sure that I'm staying on track. The plane is going to automatically level off at cruise altitude and accelerate to cruise speeds as well, so long as it's in managed mode. You can tell it's in managed mode just by looking at the autopilot panel. So for example, for speed, we don't see a number, there's just that dot right next to it, which is what tells me that the airplane is handling it for me. It's at this point that I can relax a little bit just because cruise is going to be fairly simple and there's not really much to do, and I can start to prepare the next phase of flight, which is going to be the descent, approach, and landing. I hope you learned something useful in this video, and if you did, please make sure to hit the like button, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them below.